What if I told you that you could train your body and brain to behave like a Navy SEAL, right in the comfort of your own living room? Well, this is the first in a series on breathing, specifically the primary concepts on high ventilation, breath holds. I'll touch on CO2 and how the stress response influences it all. Hi, my name is Soule, and I want to show you how you can learn to leverage the key pathways of stress to propel you towards your best life. Because breathing is so dynamic and intricate, the way I've set up today's discussion is by first outlining the primary concepts, then breaking down how the concept works, and finally, why you should care about this anyway. Some of what is presented might sound perfectly logical, and other comments might go against preconceived notions and ideas. In any case, hey, if questions pop up, don't hesitate to reach out for further explanation. I'm happy to go as deep into the woods as you're interested in coming with me. Now, the first topic is a discussion of high ventilation breathing, combined with intermittent breath holds like that found in the Wim Hof Method or cyclic hyperventilation protocols. One of the primary goals of high ventilation breathing is to saturate both the blood and tissues with oxygen using the nose, mouth, or both. This effectively raises the body's tolerance to very high levels of oxygen. It is often paired by increased levels of adrenaline while speeding up metabolism, clearing metabolic waste, temporarily disrupting and shifting blood chemistry. As my friend Wim Hof says, "You are the alchemist." This is all a massive reset for the body, especially when combined with extended breath holds. So how does it all work? By breathing relatively faster, deeper, and more than we need in these breathing exercises, we take ourselves into a controlled stress response. The higher ventilation dilates the lungs, saturating them with excess oxygen. That oxygen moves to the relatively lower pressures in the blood and then floods the still lower pressures of the tissues. At the same time, we blow off tons of CO2 during this process. This all continues until oxygen saturation and partial pressures reach their upper limits. And there we are, blissed out and ready for an intentional breath hold. The breath hold steers us down to a more calming state. CO2 slowly builds up again in the body, but since it started off so low, it takes time. Meanwhile, oxygen, tissue saturation, and partial pressures remain relatively high for extended periods as well, until both of those eventually decline. Now, these factors, the low CO2 in the body and the relatively higher oxygen partial pressures that remain for extended periods, both shift our need to breathe, allowing for many of us to be able to hold our breath for quite a long time, often several minutes. And then finally, at the bottom of the breath hold, one of two things happens. CO2 is built up enough so that we get a very strong urge to breathe, or oxygen partial pressures have declined to the point that sends a trigger to breathe. And we take a deep breath in and start again. So why should you care about all this? Well, by taking ourselves into a controlled stress response, followed immediately by a rest and recovery response during the breath holds, we train the body and mind to stress and recover very quickly. This creates better adaptability between these two states. And since very few people have trouble getting into a stress state, but many struggle greatly from getting out of that state and back into rest and recovery modes, this type of adaptability is really important. Plus, effectively raising the floor and lowering the ceiling of what the body and mind are able to tolerate in terms of oxygen and CO2 concentrations, along with the associated chemistry that results, is a great asset to widening comfort zones. This breathing style also gives you a burst of energy. And finally, this type of breathing can be used to improve and maintain respiratory health, strengthening all the muscles as well. Really powerful. Now, the next concept is paired to the one we just went over, but I'm going to focus specifically on the stress response, how to induce it or how to mitigate it using the breath. In both situations, we want to find the balance for high performance. The stress response can be from an outside source, right? Not limited to, but including things like an ice bath or potential conflict, or from the inside through the breath. How we breathe can be voluntary or it can be automatic, and knowing how to harness it is critical. So how does this all work? Well, generally speaking, faster breaths induce a more action-oriented response, while slower breaths tend to downregulate that response. Another factor is where we emphasize in the breath. Right? For example, focusing on an inhale increases stress, and focusing on an exhale calms us. Now check this out. Our goal when taking an ice bath or getting into freezing natural waters or de-escalating a conflict is to moderate that external stressor by controlling the speed and length of the breath. We want to harness it, getting that rhythm down as early as possible, and then shift the breath to slow and longer exhales. This will train us to remain calm amidst the chaos of stress. Now, by contrast, when training faster breathing exercises at rest, our goal is to use controlled hyperventilation to induce the stress response, which means that blood will very quickly be rerouted around the body, in this case to the larger muscles and organs typically involved in a fight or flight response. However, even as we induce stress with our breathing, we want to remain calm in our mind and body. All of the training described here will reinforce a relationship of high adrenaline and rapidly leveled off cortisol, which is a hallmark of high performers. Everyone from Navy SEALs to top NBA players, from exceptional public speakers to others exhibiting that flow state or being in the zone. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't segue briefly to discuss some of the common myths and misunderstandings around high ventilation breathing. A common myth or misunderstanding is that over-breathing at rest deprives the brain of oxygen. Now, this is simply not true. The brain has multiple ways to ensure it has sufficient oxygen, even with reduced blood flow due to a stress response. Now, this rapid shift in blood pressure, though, can happen, and it can cause lightheadedness, as well as blood quickly being shifted to different areas of the body. Additionally, because we're not exercising, we don't have the use of our large leg muscles to assist the blood pumping around. So lightheadedness can be substantial, especially for the untrained or people with limited training. As this is done for extended periods of time, such as multiple rounds over several minutes, this overloading of oxygen will contribute to a disruption of chemistry, including, among other things, potassium in the cell, calcium ion accumulation, increasing action potentials. This causes like cramping and tense muscles. And the buffer system in the blood, which temporarily increases the blood's pH to a more alkaline state. So this is all quickly restabilized once we return to a slower breathing rate and/or include a breath hold to steer ourselves back to calm. So where does the beneficial hypoxia or hypoxemia come from in cyclic hyperventilation, the Wim Hof Method or other similar styles? Well guys, it comes from the breath holds. As we shift the brain's autoregulation of breathing stimuli from both decreased CO2 and increased oxygen partial pressures, we are able to hold our breath for extended periods, eventually getting our blood oxygen saturation down a lot. A trained person can get blood oxygen saturation down into the 50s, and a few may even be able to go lower. So this is quite different from, say, standard blood saturations of 95 to 99% in healthy people at rest. Further, during breath holds, our tissue saturation drops as well, though the tissues have far less of a change than does our blood. Tissues vary substantially in terms of base saturations and partial pressures, so for simplicity's sake, just have the takeaway that those will remain lower than in the blood. Why should you care about all this? The questions around self-induced hyperventilation have a lot of myths and misunderstandings. It's been presumed that because there's a temporary reduction in blood flow to the brain when hyperventilating at rest, that this somehow translates to hypoxia. There is virtually zero evidence that this is true. What actually happens is the exact opposite. The brain and body's tissues get overloaded with oxygen. In response, the body and brain compensate using a variety of mechanisms. One of the early shifts is sending excess blood and oxygen to various parts of the body that can tolerate higher levels. As oxygen partial pressures remain high, blood flow is further reduced in the brain. However, at no point of self-induced hyperventilation do the brain tissues or blood become hypoxic or hypoxemic, respectively. The exception is if people are doing shallow and rapid breathing with their mouths and throats wide open. This results in almost no air and thus oxygen actually entering the system in the first place. So too much of the air gets lost to anatomical dead space. The anatomy I'm referring to in this case is the big upside down tree-looking structure you have inside your chest and throat. Those are the conducting tubes of your respiratory system, namely the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles. If air doesn't actually enter the system, people pass out quickly and autoregulation of breathing resumes to restore balance. I typically refer to this as a nervous system takeover. It's one of the preventative measures that your nervous system takes to protect you. Bottom line, avoid that type of breathing. If you're going to use the mouth, and in these exercises, it is often recommended to do so for ideal effects, make sure you're breathing with the mouth correctly. Next, because controlled hyperventilation or even deep breathing while at rest does not include working legs, such as we'd have during exercise, remember that blood is going to be rerouted primarily through vasoconstriction, that narrowing of vessels, and the pumping of the heart. That's basically the only means of controlling blood flowing around the body. So to reduce the load on your heart, it's almost always best to do this lying down so that you have to work the least against gravity. Now, this happens to also be the safest and most recommended way to do these exercises. So last reason you should care. This induced stress response is a powerful disruption in the body that allows for a great reset once homeostasis returns. Previous patterning can be rewritten and new habits can be easily adopted. Just make sure you practice with a calm mind, deep emotional connection, and develop a greater awareness of the breath throughout your day. If you're new to stress training protocols, or if you're looking to optimize existing routines, be sure to check out my other video on best cold training practices. That way you can optimize all of your cold training. Until next time, remember to breathe.